How many of you have already used SQL containers before? Oh, nice, nice. I know about you, Jeff. That hand doesn't count.
We'll convert you.
This is good because in previous conferences, I remember we just had probably one hand or zero hands raised when I asked the question about SQL containers and Kubernetes. So this
Oh,
is good.
oh, 6 years ago when I started doing this presentation, people asked me, what is a container?
People still ask me
And
that.
I'm not the Linux expert, but I had to become a Linux expert and start explaining the whole container stack before going to the SQL part of it. That, let's just say, those were interesting days.
Yeah,
Well, yeah,
sort of.
it is. It is process virtualization, but it's the shared part of it is not very well understood.
People who are using containers right now, using it for dev, QA, engineering systems, engineering? Anyone else? I saw 3 or 4 hands go up. Yeah,
We love that.
yeah. And the spin up and crashing it probably in seconds, or oh,
Oh,
nice,
nice.
nice.
Very nice.
And Ubuntu based images or rel UBI, anything? Nice. Would you be surprised if we said that there are multiple customers already running SQL containers, SQL Server and Linux in production? And I'm talking about the production workloads.
Oops, sorry.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Perspective, a lot versus some, but we've got some of the biggest ones today running SQL containers, SQL on Linux, and for their production workloads. And in the last 5 years, what we've seen is that growth actually just exponentially going up. And the kind of advantages that they have is fabulous. And I think one of the demos that we kind of have here is to show you that it's just the same SQL Server that you've been working with for so many years. It's that same SQL engine which runs across multiple platforms. So it's just a choice that you have where you want to deploy and get started with SQL Server. So another couple of minutes, we'll just wait, and then we'll get started at 9, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm doing this session with my manager. So if you have tough questions, please keep them for later. Once he walks out of the room. Just an FYI. Yeah, that's a good idea. Probably you'll just send it right back to me. So, I didn't sign up for this. I was made to sign up for this. So, FYI. I just wanted to go me and him. He's like, put me in as well. I'm like, okay.
It's Linux containers. I have got to be there.
So my review depends on this. All right. Yeah, yeah. We request you to please provide the feedback after the session because that's fine.
That feedback is separate. We can have that separately. But But for the session, please do provide the
For the
feedback.
feedback.
There is a charitable donation that is associated with it, and we would really appreciate to hear from you personally as well as for the community.
Yeah. Thank you. And anyways, he's the main speaker, so the feedback goes to him.
No, that's just being a good manager. You get blamed for everything, right?
Awesome. I think we should probably get started. Thank you so much. It's a Saturday morning, 9 a.m. I'm sure you all have coffees in your hand, and I hope the next 40 minutes you just don't even realize when it goes by, because the kind of content that we have today is to kind of show you that SQL Server on containers, SQL Server on Kubernetes is right now, is happening today, is not something that's going to happen in the future. It's not something that's going to happen 2 years later. It's happening today. There are a lot of customers who are running this, and we wanted to share all of that with you. So without any further delay, let's get started and let's introduce ourselves. I'll go first. My name's Amit Khandelwal. I am a principal product manager reporting to Tejas, and my job description basically says to lead the technical strategy for SQL Server on Linux and containers or any non-Windows platform here at Microsoft. With that, over to you, Tejas.
Hello, folks. My name is Tejas. I'm the principal PM in Azure SQL team. I lead a couple of businesses, one being Azure SQL migration tooling, but my primary passion for last 6 years has been SQL Server on Linux and containers. I'm the business lead for SQL Server on Linux and containers at Microsoft. Essentially, that means that everything to do with SQL Server on Linux and containers, I get blamed for it. So
All right, and we also have a special speaker with us today. We asked him to join us. This is our partner from DH2i, who
guys.
provides us the cluster stack. His name is OJ, and thank you so much, OJ, for being with us and partnering with us on this for this session.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And I think we have a very good show for you guys today. So
Thank you.
perfect.
Perfect. Okay, let's get started. What's there in the agenda? First and foremost, we would definitely want to give you an overview. What is SQL Server Linux all about? What are some of the features that are supported? And then we want to talk about a very specific demo that we've got. It's a 5-minute demo, but the point of having that demo is to just give you an idea that this SQL Server engine that you have, it basically runs the same as it runs on Windows. So I'm going to show you a demo where we'll have an availability group created, and the replicas of that availability group are going to be SQL and Windows box, a container, and a Linux box. So that is the demo that we are going to show, and we'll do it real time. I'm joking. We are not going to do it real time. We have it all, recorded. So I'm going to play the video, but I'm actually going to take you through all of those steps. Then we are going to talk about the overview for SQL Server containers. So we are going to get into the nitty-gritties of how SQL Server runs into a container. What are some of the features that you've got? What are they supported for? And finally, we'll talk about the high availability stack. And we'll request OJ to come and talk about the DH2i stack as one of the partners there. And at last, when we leave this session, I would want all of you to have some reference architectures, reference configurations, and benchmarks available with you, which you can go back, read, and you could also deploy this if that reference architecture is anything close to any environment database modernization that you are looking to. So with that said, let's get started, and let's go with the deployment options. Tejas, do you want to talk about the deployment options here?
Perfect. So first of all, when it comes to SQL Server on Linux, the very first thing that comes to mind is, how do I deploy it? With Windows, it's always been about you deploy an instance, it just works, that's a story. But when it comes to Linux, the story is far more interesting, and sometimes it can get complicated. So basically, you can deploy SQL Server on Linux VMs or bare metal servers, directly on the OS itself. And we have three Linux operating systems that we support, Linux versions that we support. We have got Red Hat Enterprise Linux, SUSE Linux Enterprise, and Ubuntu. And don't ask me why those Linux Enterprise and Enterprise Linux are reverse. Still trying to figure that one out. But those are the three OS distributions that we support. We do know that some of our customers have been using some of the other distributions like CentOS, Debian, Fedora for some testing. We do not test them, we do not validate them, but for testing purposes, we have seen customers use them, and we are okay.
So
It's
are you saying that I can run SQL Server on CentOS or I can run it on Fedora and it would work?
it does work. The only difference is that because we have not validated it, we can't be 100% certain about the functionality. If it is so if you come to us for support and ask us the question about it does for SQL Server on Debian or Fedora, this particular thing does not work. Now, if it is an obvious SQL issue, sure, we'll work upon it. But if we are not certain, we may ask you to reproduce the issue on one of the supported platforms where we have validated that functionality. That's the only real difference. Along with that, containers bring in very interesting story on Linux. So you can run containers on uh, well, SQL Server on Linux containers on directly on the bare metal. We actually see a lot of that. Uh, when you have in a small in a business or small deployments, uh, doing a Kubernetes environment can be actually an overhead. So we have seen some customers deploy containers directly on the VMs, just works for them. You can also deploy it on Kubernetes, and there are certain customers who have humongous Kubernetes environments. They've got administrators to manage them, and they can deploy it, and you can deploy SQL Server containers in many different configurations over there. But then again, there are managed Kubernetes environments as well. You have got Azure Red Hat OpenShift, Azure Kubernetes environments, and essentially you can deploy your containers on that as well. So this essentially makes this very interesting chart for you. And whenever I present this chart, everybody asks me a question. Wow, SQL on Linux is complicated. No, it's not. Don't worry about that. More often than not, all you have to do is basically figure out what is your use case. Once you figure out your use case, you will actually end up with one or two deployment methods. And we have practically automation for most of those scenarios anyway. Once you, basically establish your one or two patterns, those are the only ones you need to know. You don't need to know everything under the sun. And we will have tooling to help you out for those scenarios as well. So this is an interesting chart. It just shows you the possibility. You just don't need to know all the possibilities.
So basically, when you want to deploy, looking at what your future is or what your current present is, you can choose any one of these platforms and we'll be available for you there. When I say we, it's SQL Server will be available for you there. Now, while we talk about this, I just want to talk about the SQL Server. Tejas, is this the same SQL Server engine?
Absolutely. And this is one of the coolest things that we have done in a really long time. We took the SQL Server on Windows binary, put a very thin wrapper on it, which is essentially a system called translation layer. We call it SQL PAL, platform abstraction layer. And we just run that same binary, Windows binary on Linux. It's as simple as that. If you want to have a discussion about how we do it, that's a whole different story, and we can have a separate discussion on that. But all you have to remember is that it's the same SQL Server that comes with the same functionality, and it's supported in exactly the same way. In fact, the query processing, the storage, everything works exactly the same.
So are you saying that if I have similar resources on Windows, similar resources on Linux, and I have the SQL Server installed with the same version, the query plan, and if I run the same query, the query plan that's generated for SQL Server on Windows, SQL on containers, or SQL on Linux is going to be the same?
Exactly. As long as your resources are the same, it's the same query processing code path. Everything remains same. So nothing really changes. You get the same functionality. You get the same storage engine. In fact, you can detach your database on Windows, attach it on Linux, do your operation, detach it on Linux, attach it on Windows, just works.
You're stealing the thunder out of the demo. Just hold on, please. so, so
Hey, I'm very excitable guy, and this is the thing I have been doing for so many years. I want to talk more about it.
so just to give you an idea, this is basically the same SQL Server engine. The only difference is how you get started with it, how you basically go ahead and deploy it. So you have multiple container packages. For example, if you want to download a container package for SQL Server and get started with it, this Microsoft Artifact Registry has two options for you. One, the containers that are based on Ubuntu. Second are the containers that are based on Red Hat UBI images. which ones would you be using? If you look at the technical support documentation that we have published for SQL Server, it's clearly written that if you are using the host as a Red Hat Enterprise Linux, then we recommend that you go ahead and download and run the Red Hat-based container OS images. If you're using Ubuntu, then you go ahead and run Ubuntu. If you're using SLES, you can run customized container images as well. And that is the second point that we want to talk about. Can I customize my own SQL Server container images? Yes, you can absolutely customize your own SQL Server container images. So if you are running SLES environments and you want to create a SQL Server container image on SLES, you can do that. There is a repo there. And if you have feedback, always go ahead and give the feedback there. It's basically being looked by the entire PG team. We review those feedbacks and then merge whatever issues have been raised on that particular repository. So if you have feedbacks, please do let us know about it.
Amit, quick question. What about the support part of the customized container? For example, if I create a SUSE container, what part of the support is supported by Microsoft and what part is by the SUSE?
SQL Server is supported by Microsoft, and the OS is supported by the SUSE. So in case of Windows, if you run SQL on Windows, when you had issues with SQL Server, you called Microsoft. SQL Server team worked on it, and internally we called in the support teams for Windows to kind of help us. Here as well, there are scenarios where you can actually get this support integrated as well. For example, if you deploy SQL Server on Ubuntu Pro using the images that are made available in Azure Marketplace, that support is already integrated into the image itself. So once you deploy that image and use your SQL Server, you can just call the Azure support. It would support SQL Server as well as the Ubuntu, because we can then call in the Ubuntu support team to help us on the calls, because that is part of the support contract. So there are scenarios where this support is integrated. There are scenarios where you need to have the support contracts with the OS. With that said, I've said it's all the same, it's everything works, but there are few things that does not work. And that is something that I wanted to highlight here. If you look at the database engine components, all the latest SQL Server 22 database components or the features that you have with the database, all of that works. What does not work have been listed here. But for all this list that we have, for example, the link server does not work for heterogeneous data sources, does not work on Linux. But we have a workaround with Polybase, and you can use the Polybase for those scenarios. If that doesn't work in your environment for your scenarios, let us know about it. We have a documentation link right there, which basically has, for most of these scenarios that are not working, we have a workaround suggested. If it does not work for you, do let us know. We want to hear those scenarios. We want to know more about those scenarios, and we want to help you on those scenarios so that we can make the product better, and it basically is what you would want it to look like. On the EKM, I have a surprise that I want to share with all of you at the last part of the deck, where we will talk about EKM feature. There is something coming up, or actually there is something which is already out for EKM part of it.
And while he's preparing for the demonstration of next slide, if you take a look at some of the features over here, you will realize that there are two kinds of features where we have had challenges. One is where we had some operating system integration like file stream, where certain functionality is not provided by operating system, and creating alternative has been difficult, which is why they are not there. Some of them are related to some security things, and those are coming. For example, TLS 1.3 support, we promise it will be there very, very soon. So we are working on filling in gap for quite a few of the features, and we will iterate over this to make sure that for anything important, you will get full functionality as soon as possible.
All right. We've spoken about the same SQL engine, the same things. Let's just see this all in action. So here we have this environment. I do not know if you can see this, but let's zoom in. And in this environment, you'll see, what is this that I've opened on SSMS? Anyone wants to take a guess? What's this window portal? This is your always-on dashboard, your regular always-on dashboard. And if you notice, there are 3 replicas added to it. And they're just not different in the terms of name. The first one is an Linux VM running on Azure. The second one there is a container which is running in Azure Kubernetes service. The third one there is a VM which is running locally on my machine. And that's basically a VM that's running, I think, Windows 22 Data Center Edition. So I have 3 different replicas. And if you don't believe me, I'm just going to run the DMVs as well, just to show you that one is a container, the other is a VM, and this is a container based on Ubuntu. As you can see here, this is a container based on Ubuntu, and the other one is a VM, and the third one is a Windows box, which is running on my environment. And what I'm showing you right now, this is fully supported. So you can set up this hybrid environment where you can have your SQL Server spread across. And the clustering stack that we are using for this is what DH2i provides us. So DH2i is one of those clustering stacks that's available on Windows as well as on Linux. And that is why this is possible, because now I can just move my database from one environment to the other without even thinking what's actually running it under the hood. So now you'd actually see, I'll go open a DX admin console, which is a UI mode, and I'm going to initiate a failover. So it's right now primary on Windows. I'll just initiate a failover. With a click of a button, the failover happens, and you'll see the SQL Server running from or moving from a Windows box to a container. So the database actually comes online, goes offline on the Windows, and comes online on the container just with the click of a button, and everything syncs back again. You can do this. We have customers who are doing this today in production environments. Scenarios are their production workload is currently running SQL Server on Windows. They have their read queries redirected to the Linux boxes, and the containers is what is used by the development team to kind of get the data real time, what's happening on the production scenarios. So as you can see, now the container has become the primary. It's easier to believe than to say that it's the same SQL engine, because right now we just did a failover between 3 different environments located at 3 different places with the DH2i cluster stack where we were able to do this. So that is what we've been saying for such a long time, that this is the same SQL Server engine that you have. Any questions here? Because I know some of you are looking amused, confused. Yeah. Yes. Yes, absolutely.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I'll repeat the question. It's just, so the question is, can we run this for a sustained time and not just for migration scenarios? And the answer to that question is yes. This is fully supported. You can run it for as long as you want, and this is completely supported and not just for migrations. So this is a fully supported scenario for production environments as well.
Well,
With
typically it is used for migration or some validation scenarios, but it's not as if it's going to stop working. The technology is there; it just works. It's just that most people find better use of it for certain migration or validation scenarios.
and to get all of this working, it just took me, you know how many hours it took me to get all of this working? Take a guess. That's not 52 lines of code. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
okay. To be honest, it just took me about, if I remove the time taken to install SQL Server on Windows, I'm not just comparing anything here, but if I remove that particular time and just talk about the container deployment and the Linux deployment and the cluster stack deployment, it took me about 6 lines of code. The reason you see those as 52 is because I have another demo added there, but it took me about 6 lines of code and 52 to 90 seconds. So it took me about 50 to 90 seconds to kind of set this up and running, and I just ran 5 commands, and then I went to get my coffee. Before the coffee was ready, the containers were deployed, always on configured, everything working for a quick failover. And the database size, if I'm not wrong, the one which I'm showing you was around 20, 30 GB. So that is the kind of speed we are talking here. Perfect. With that said, let's go next. Let's talk about container overview. Now, first and foremost, is this container a SQL Server instance, or is this different?
Container is nothing but a SQL Server instance. I mean, there is nothing really different over here. It's just a deployment mechanism. We actually don't think of containers any differently than SQL Server on Linux. It's just a packaging vehicle. It's a deployment mechanism. It has got no bearing to uh, what you might think about an instance in the Windows terms. It's not a named instance or anything like that. It's just an instance. That's it.
And what about the updates that we release? Let's say CU gets released for SQL Server on Windows on a particular day. Does the Linux follow up after a week, a month?
Nope. Same day, same time. We release all SQL Server CUs for Windows and Linux at exactly the same time. There is absolutely no delay at all with the release vehicles.
Yes. So the release cadence, not just for the Linux, but even for the container images that we publish, happens on that same day when the SQL on Windows release happens. So there's no difference in the days of the release cadences for the updates that basically happen. Also, we've worked with a lot of our partners. Again, Linux is all about open source and working with the community, working with the partners, and that's what we've done with SQL Server as well. We've created sample Helm charts, and our partners like DH2i have made those Helm charts available on marketplaces like Rancher. We have other customers who have created Terraform-based deployments for SQL Server containers. We have Ansible scripts. We've worked very closely with Red Hat engineering, and we've been able to create Ansible scripts, which are now part of the operating system to kind of help you deploy SQL Server in the best recommended way with all the configurations already taken care of. So all you've got to do is just install the system role, get your playbook ready, and then just run the playbook, which goes ahead and then installs SQL Server into multiple targets. Yes, we have playbooks published. We have, in fact, the entire Ansible system Galaxy has the system role for SQL Server published with all the environment variables defined. We actually have two branches of it. We have a developer branch and we have a production branch. A developer branch is where you would see new features. For example, with Ansible, you can actually go ahead and configure Active Directory authentication, TLS encryption. You could also go ahead and configure the TuneD profiles for the operating system. All of that, we have a published, the playbook, and you could just use that and immediately run it. And if you're working with the enterprise branch of the Ansible, whatever features are being published on developer, you would see them come onto the enterprise in a gap of about 2 months. So the Red Hat team works on it, brings it to the production environment in about 2 months. So that is the close engineering we have.
Yeah. So basically, let me put it this way: that we worked upon, some of the early documentation that you will see here, the SQL Server container guidance. You will find the link when you get the deck as well. We published, the basic documentation about how to deploy containers. Then we found great partners in OSS ecosystem, and I'll be honest, in the OSS ecosystem, we have found so many amazing partners, starting with Canonical, Red Hat, SUSE. We have had partners like DH2i, Pure Storage. We have had we have had so many other partners like HPE, who has provided another container or the container deployment solution, as well as they've got high availability stack as well. I mean, in general, the OSS ecosystem has been amazing to work with us in developing all these interesting solutions that will help you deploy SQL Server in an amazingly fast way.
Perfect. Now, one of the other questions that I get asked most is, what are some of the container scenarios that we have seen customers using SQL Server? We were talking about this just before the start of the session. Have I seen customers using SQL Server containers for production workloads? Now, let me give you some of the examples. Again, these are just some of the examples, not all of them. These are some of the examples that we know of, the scenarios that we know of, because we've been in those discussions with the customer. I've had customer who wanted to run multiple SQL Server instances on the same host. Remember, when we talk about containers, it's not always about Kubernetes. You can also run containers on a standalone host where you want the resource utilization to be the optimized. You can run multiple SQL Server containers, and we know of a customer who runs their production workload for their end customers on containers on single standalone hosts, and they're able to isolate multiple of such customers because every customer has one single container running for them, which has an entire SQL Server instance. Remember, the entire SQL Server instance is what is running inside those container images. It's not one database, two database. It's an entire SQL Server instance that you get. that is one of those examples. Do you want to talk about database as a service, Tejas?
Yeah, that's an interesting scenario that we have started to see develop. We have had many customers, basically the IT systems of these major corporations, enterprises, and they say, you know what, we have this problem. Every time we have this all these departments, billing department, transport department, the accounting department, they all want their instances, they all want it yesterday, and they all want it in very varying different configuration. How do I go about this? If I deploy a new VM every time and then deploy instance on it, it takes me forever to get all of that done. And they have started exploring containers. They have actually we know of certain customers who deployed this in database as a service internally for their own departments, and they cross charge it. Essentially all the container usage is fairly well recorded. They just deploy containers for all these departments, and simply cross charge it to those departments. And Kubernetes provides those process isolation, it provides them resource isolation, it just works for them. This database as a service model using containers, it's really catching on.
And just to add on to this, I know Tejas is going to be upset with me after this, but I still got to say this. It's not just customers. We have partners who are actually running SQL Server containers and providing managed database services as well. So we do have partners who are not only providing internal customers, but their external customers who are running SQL Server as well.
Yeah. We'll talk later.
Next, I also want to talk about some of the development scenarios. Running database in a CI/CD model, where you have your application running close to the database. Running databases for functional testing for every app change that you basically do. For every A/B testing that you want to perform against different versions of SQL Server. All of the dev, QA testing, we've seen some fantastic growth for SQL Server containers where customers basically use that with various versions and then basically run their testing, their engineering, their functionality test, stress test against different versions of application versus the different versions of SQL Server as well. So those are some of the other.
Do you know any name?
Uh, do you want me to say the names right now?
I'm just saying, if you recall anything off top of your head, because it's a Saturday morning, I don't know if you have had coffee or not.
No, I'm not going to say the name. Next, I also want to talk about, like I said, these are just some of the scenarios that I know of or that we know of, but there are multiple more scenarios that we cannot bring all here. But as I said, SQL containers, SQL Server is available where you want, and we will meet you on the platforms that you want. And the first slide that we showed is basically what you want to just keep in mind and see what fits the best for your environment at this point of time. With that said, I think another option that I want to talk, and I get a question a lot many times, is Active Directory supported for SQL Server containers? Is it very tough for me to get started with SQL Server containers? Can I use all the latest features for SQL Server containers? Can I use SE Linux for SQL Server containers when they're running on Red Hat host? Because SE Linux is a way of running things in a secure format. And the answer to all of those questions is yes. All of those scenarios are supported. The scenarios that are not supported are very well documented. Only the scenarios that have been listed in the third slide that we showed, only those are not supported. So if you have those scenarios, you have not found the workaround to be helpful, please talk to us. We'd like to understand why that is not helpful and what we could do to kind of make things easier for you. And for the rest of the things, Active Directory, Entra ID authentication, the Purview, Ledger, all the latest features that you have, everything is supported for SQL Server on Linux. On containers, like I mentioned, the Entra ID authentication is currently not available on containers, but Active Directory authentication is absolutely available.
How about you just show it,
Yes.
How about, let's talk more demos?
Yes, let's do this. In this demo, what I want to show you is two things. I'm using a custom container image, which means I created my own SQL Server image based out of SLES. I did not want to use the ones that are already published, so I created my own image. I have a host here, which is not part of the Windows domain. So I'm going to run a container, and I'm going to enable Active Directory authentication for that container. And that container runs a SQL Server image, which is built on SLES. It's not built on the ones that are already published. So it's customized image. Now I've already customized the image, made it available on my container registry. So I'm not going to go there, but I'm going to go and talk about what you can do basically to enable Active Directory authentication. With that said, let's look at the script that you have. Right now, while we go through these steps, also I want to tell you now you can do all of this with just one step. If you run adutil tool and then you have MSSQL config, you can run a command called as setup key for SQL Server, and that would do all these SPN creations. Your user creation needs to be done, but SPN creation and key tab creation is taken care by default. Now, for any Active Directory authentication to work, what you need is Kerberos. NTLM does not work in Linux environment, so you need Kerberos. And for Kerberos to work, you need to create a key tab, and you need to create SPNs. And that's exactly what I'm doing right now. My container name is sql/contoso.com. My SPN that I'm creating is for this user called as /user. /user was a user that I created in step 1. Step 2, I'm just adding SPNs to that particular user because it's Kerberos, so I need SPNs to be able to enable. And then finally, I create a key tab, and this key tab has the SPN details as well as the user details added to it. And once I create the key tab, I'll get back to the question. Once I create the key tab, all I got to do, because I'm going to enable Active Directory authentication for the container, I need to make these key tabs the kub5.configuration, which has the details about the realm or the domain that I want to connect. All of that needs to be made available to the container. And that's what I'm doing here. Inside I've created a storage, which I'm going to mount on the container. And there you can see I've already created the key tab, the one with the step 3 that we used. And then I also have the kub5.config, which basically has the details of my Active Directory and domain controller. As you can see, I have the default realm, the domain controller information, all of that. And finally, I go ahead and deploy the SQL Server container using the command. Let's just do this. This is the MSSQL config. It's the configuration manager in SQL Server Linux. So I'm basically saying this is the Active Directory user using which I would connect. And then once all of that is done, I just run the image, and you can see I have mounted each of those files into the container, updated the resolution configuration file with the add host contoso.com and all the other details for the Active Directory. And please note, the image that I'm using is actually a /based image, which is coming from my own container registry. This is a custom image. And once this is done, once I go ahead and execute this, once I have the container up and running, you would notice I just need to go back to the SSMS. Let's just do that. So let's just wait a minute.
By the way, this is because Amit is a technical enthusiast. He has shown you all the commands. Technically speaking, you can put all of this in a single bash script, parameterize the hell out of it, and simply just, you have one single command line that basically does everything for you. It can be, basically optimized away completely.
Yes. Like I said, you can use the MSSQL config setup adutil option. And here, I'm just connecting to SQL Server. First, I connect with the SA, create the login. If you want to browse the login through the SSMS the way you do, that also works here. So I just created the login, and now when I want to connect, is just select the Windows authentication, and it just works. That's all it is to the Active Directory authentication.
As I said, the commands, may look interesting, but it can be completely optimized away.
Every one of us here is a technical person, so I'm 100% sure you would like to know
Automation. If you want to deploy containers in an automated fashion with a fully configured Windows authentication, just create a script around it, put it over there, give it to everybody, and they can play with it all day long. Everything will just work.
Now you know why I don't like to give sessions with them. Anyways, with that said, let's talk about business continuity and high availability. Before we go there, I think, Jeff, you had a question. You need dedicated admin rights to create the... No. Okay.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. The question is, do you need delegated rights to create the SPNs? And what are the rights that are needed to create the user. So you want to take it?
Well, go ahead and take it.
Okay. So the first things first, to create, you need to have a right in Active Directory to create a user, and you need to have the right to create SPNs. So if you have these two permissions, that is good enough for you to get started. We are using the AD util tool, and using that, you can create the user. So if you saw in the step 1, I just created the user and then created SPN. You don't need delegation rights for that user creation or SPN creations. All right, with that, let's get into the business continuity stack. And this has been an interesting journey for us because for any business continuity, you need a cluster stack. And Windows failover cluster stack was not available on Linux. What a surprise. It was only available on Windows for us. So when we had to develop something like availability groups for SQL Server on Linux, the dilemma was how to run Windows Server failover cluster on Linux. So the name says Windows Server failover cluster, but it has to run on Linux. So that was the kind of the situation that we were in. And that is where we found out that our ecosystem had multiple options for us to kind of go ahead and use. And that is where this stack comes into the picture, where on WSFC, you have something like a resource DLL. On the world of Pacemaker, you have something like an MS SQL Server HA agent that we keep, which we maintain, which is used by Pacemaker. You also have HPE Service Guard. You also have DH2i. So all of these cluster stacks are fully supported. Which one should you use? How do I answer that question, Tejas? Which one should customers use?
That's totally up to you. You decide what's your requirement, you validate it, you test it, and you pick the one that works for you. It's as simple as that. And to boil it down to very simply speaking, once again, SQL Server is SQL Server. The always on availability group between Windows and Linux, it is exactly the same. The T-SQL is same, the functionality is same, everything remains same, but the high availability component where we rely upon the operating system to provide us the high availability signals, that's not the same. So we have been on Windows, we rely upon Windows failover cluster. On Linux, we have had amazing partners like once again DH2i, HPE, and the OS vendors themselves for pacemaker clusters, and we have just integrated with them to read into their high availability signals to provide high availability via always on availability group or failover clusters.
And to make things easier, we have another slide deck here for you, which basically says what cluster stack is available where. So if you have an environment which spans across multiple distributions, you have Windows, Linux, containers, you see that your database estate modernization projects could take you to containers, or could take you to Kubernetes, or could take you to Linux, or could take you to Windows, then you can choose one of the partners which is available there. If you have, let's say you already have Pacemaker running in your environment and you want to use SQL Server with that, you could use Pacemaker in those scenarios. If you have, let's say, HP Service Guard, which is working with, let's say, SAP or Oracle, you could use that. And with HP Service Guard, we are happy to announce that HP Service Guard team has announced the support for SQL Server container workloads on clustering stack with HP Service Guard as well. So that is a new announcement that came in with the HP Service Guard release 15.2, and you can find all the documentation there, and the link is added to the slide deck as well. So if you want to run Windows, Linux, containers, Kubernetes mixed platform, then you have DH2i as an option that you can choose for. So it's up to you. What is the preference? What is your requirement? And based on that, you basically can make the choice. So our job here is to show you all the cards that are available, and you can pick and choose what suits best for you. So it's your choice, your decision, what works best for you. We have all the documentation that's made available to help you make that right choice.
With that being said, though,
I think it's now time for me to also bring in OJ. But before I get OJ, I want to talk about this a lot. This particular question is asked a lot. The first question that I always get is, if you have Kubernetes and Kubernetes makes high availability stack provided, why would you need another high availability stack for SQL Server? So the whole job of Kubernetes is to bring the pod up or when it goes down, or scale up, scale down when required, then why do you need high availability? Any guesses without looking at the slide? Come on, you're reading the slide. I can see all of that. Yeah, Jeff, go ahead. Yeah, exactly. You need to meet your RPO, RTO, right? Because while the pod can be brought up by the Kubernetes, so a pod is running SQL Server. You need high availability for the database. For example, always on has the capability to be able to go offline, come online within seconds. It meets your RPO and RTO requirements. And that is the exact reason why you would need a cluster stack running on top of something like Kubernetes to provide you that. So while Kubernetes takes care of the of the cluster on the pod level, it's the cluster stack and always on features in SQL Server that takes care of the high availability of the database. And with that said, OJ, may I request you to please help explain about the DH2i stack and talk about this a little more and introduce this stack, please?
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. So before we dig deeper into the support for container, and as Tejas and Amit already talked about, it's the ability to do or to meet your RTO, your SLA, for your SQL Server running inside container, inside a Kubernetes technology. We want to look at DX Enterprise as a solution first, as a clustering solution first, right? That's a baseline for everything else after that. You start out with a clustering tech. And when we started the group, we do clustering for Windows. In fact, we were the competitor to WSFC for many years to the effect. And then when SQL Server released on Linux, we extend the stack out to Linux. So then we can do Windows the cluster or Linux cluster. And of course, as like everything else, right, it's evolved. SQL Server recently, a few years now, got introduced and supported in containers. So then we extend our DX Enterprise stack to container also. So what is DX Enterprise? It's really just a very lightweight clustering technology that runs across any platform, on any OS that you can think of, on Windows or on Linux. So on Windows, in fact, you can install DX Enterprise on a desktop machine. So client desktop OS instead of a server class OS, and any flavor of SQL of Windows. And then on Linux, just like SQL Server, it can run on SLES, Red Hat, RHEL, or Ubuntu.
Yes.
So, and once again, because the DX Enterprise itself is agnostic to the OS, you can really run on any versions of the OS that you want. So there is no limitations whatsoever on the clustering stack. And when it comes to SQL Server support, so for clustering, when we talk about clustering, normally we're talking about FCI, right? Failover clustering instance. That's the last slide. I'm going to finish that one first. You can do so already across any distro. And for FCI, obviously you would need a data, a storage of some kind to store your SQL Server data. And to do that, you need a storage of any kind, right? So DX Enterprise is supported on both what they call a share storage or replicated storage. So you are not required to have share storage only. So with that, we can go on to the support for HE. So we extended the FCI capability to support SQL Server HE workload. So for SQL HE workload, what's important here would be the ability to go across multiple platforms, Windows to Linux, Linux in container or outside container. So we extended that to support that particular scenario. And because we can support your SQL workload or HE workload to be exact across any platforms. Why not extend it further? Allow you to stretch it across sites, across environments. And to do that, we utilize a patented technology, authentication technology, that allow you to connect your replicas that can run from any site to any site without requiring to have a VPN, dedicated VPN between them, or open up your public port to allow the replicas to talk to each other. So it is a technology that built really truly for SQL AG across any platform, any environment, anywhere.
So I can have it running in multiple data centers distributed geographically without having an VPN or
Absolutely.
just with the internet connectivity, it just works.
That is correct. And you're going to be asking, how safe is my data, right? If you are doing things over the internet, well, SQL Server data transmitting between any replicas are fully encrypted. So there is no risk of having to open up your port that people can scan, ever, right? And not just that, it's so easy that you can just really install on any desktop, on any VM, on any container, and join them together. And it would take literally seconds.
Can I do that on Kubernetes as well?
Of course you can. So as I said earlier, DH Enterprise technology can run on any platform, on any flavor. You can literally do so in the Kubernetes. So when it comes to Kubernetes, the deployments, there are a few things that you want to kind of gauge and sort it out so that it fit your so-called deployment models. And this one particular slide gives you what we use, what we call the ease of usage as the scale model to rate how easy or how difficult it is to get your SQL AG running inside Kubernetes. So starting with, say, manual script. Manual script is really nothing more than you running a whole bunch of the kubectl or CLI commands, deploying the stateful set, and then bring up your SQL AG. Right? So that's a very, I would say, the basic for most of us when we started out. That's what we would do. We learn how to run the cubes. kubectl is one of those commands that you would be using to do your job. And then the next one, make things easier, Helm charts. Helm chart is nothing more than a batch process. Think of it like a macro script. Instead of running all of these kubectl commands over and over again to deploy your containers, why not create or define what they call a template YAML, and then you just deploy a single command, Helm install, and then you would get yourself a cluster running inside Kubernetes. And next, for those of us who like GUIs, Rancher implementations, we've been working with the SUSE team, getting the DH Enterprise and SQL Server image certified and posted on Rancher catalog. So it's fully up there on the stack. And you just go inside Rancher admin console, click a few buttons, and you get a full-blown DX Enterprise and SQL Server AG running. That's it. Really a few clicks. We are Android. And next is what I call the best, the fastest, the most powerful way of deploying containers inside Kubernetes. That is using SQL Server, the Kubernetes controller. And the X operator is a kube controller or the extensions to Kubernetes to allow you to fully deploy and automate the deployment. So Kubernetes is a very cool stack. And then with the X Enterprise now introducing the X operator as a controller to allow you to fully and quickly deploying your AG.
Yeah.
And there's such a long list or a few items there regarding the X operator. I know we ran out of time. So
Yes, exactly.
what I want to do then, I want to turn the stage over to Amit. I think we have about
Yes,
a few minutes
yes.
to
So,
go through this quick
yeah,
deployment.
so I would love to show you this deployment. Basically, to give you a summary, this operator can deploy 3 SQL Server instances with just 5 commands in less than 90 seconds with always on availability group configured on DH2i stack. This is going to be a 3-minute demo. I just don't want to show this, but what I would want to share is when we share this video, you can actually see this. Plus, we showed this in the theater session as well. Finally, to conclude, I also want to announce that AKV, Azure Key Vault support, is available with SQL Server containers, SQL Server and Linux. And these are some of the reference architectures that you can take a look at, which basically helps you identify how you want to run SQL Server, data analytics, OLTP, high availability, polybase, all of these are covered. Some of these reference architectures also cover throughputs of almost 8 million TPMs. With that said, I think thank you so much. I know this has been a Saturday morning. We had a lot of content to go through, but it was amazing talking to all of you guys. And if you have questions, we'll be at the booth. Come find us at Microsoft booth, and we'll be more than happy to answer questions. And we request you all, please do give us feedback. And this also helps the charity. So thank you once again. It was good talking to you all, and looking forward to talk to you or answer any questions that you might have.
And
Thank
if you
you.
want, yeah,
Thank you.
if you want to see the demo, come over to the booth. We'll play over there. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, we will. Yeah,
No,
not yet,
not yet.
but I think Ree or somebody will let us know how we can give it to SQL Bits. We want to give it to SQL Bits. It is public information. We want to make sure
Share it.
it's available everywhere.